So how are you guys? Before starting the video, a little piece of advice: you can make up the scenes on your head to enjoy further. Without further ado, let's dive into our first story. Evelyn hadn't planned to stay at her grandmother's isolated cottage in the woods for more than a weekend. But after the phone call from her estranged cousin, Leo, her plans changed. He'd been working on some family history research and needed a quiet place to work. Her grandmother's cottage, with its creaky floors and musty scent, seemed the perfect spot. That night, as the rain pounded against the windows, Evelyn sat by the flickering fire, nursing a mug of tea. The storm had arrived suddenly, dark clouds blotting out the moon and plunging the landscape into a near-impenetrable darkness. Leo was supposed to arrive by now, but as the clock ticked closer to midnight, Evelyn started to worry that a sudden knock on the door jolted her from her thoughts. She glanced at the clock. It was 11:50 p.m. Who could be knocking at this hour in this weather? The knock came again, louder and more urgent. With a deep breath, Evelyn walked to the door and peered through the peephole. The darkness outside was absolute, and no one was visible. She hesitated, then slowly opened the door. The wind howled, and rain sprayed into the foyer. There was no one there. She closed the door, shaking her head. The knock must have been a trick of the storm, she thought. She turned back to the fire, but a sudden chill made her shiver. She pulled her blanket tighter around her shoulders and tried to ignore the uneasy feeling creeping up her spine. Minutes later, another knock echoed through the house. This time, it was accompanied by a soft, pitiful sound, a wailing, almost childlike. Evelyn's heart raced. She approached the door with trepidation, her hand shaking as she reached for the knob. Outside, the rain was even heavier, the noise almost deafening. She pulled the door open, but there was still no one in sight. She glanced around, her eyes straining against the darkness, but the rain obscured everything. The wailing continued, faint but persistent, coming from somewhere within the storm. Suddenly, Evelyn saw a shadow dart across the lawn. Her breath caught in her throat. It was a figure, a dark, indistinct shape moving rapidly. She slammed the door shut, bolting it this time. Her hands were trembling uncontrollably. She rushed to the window, peering through the rain-slicked glass. The shadow moved closer to the cottage. Evelyn's fear intensified as the figure seemed to draw nearer, now visible as a dark silhouette against the torrential downpour. The wailing grew louder, more desperate. The power went out, plunging the room into darkness. Evelyn fumbled for her flashlight, the only source of light in the pitch-black cottage. She managed to turn it on, its beam cutting through the darkness. She pointed it toward the window, and her heart nearly stopped. The figure was now directly outside, its face obscured by the storm. But its eyes, they glowed with an eerie, unnatural light, reflecting the flashlight's beam with a haunting intensity. The wailing had become a scream, a tortured cry that pierced the howling wind. Panicking, Evelyn grabbed her phone to call Leo, but the signal was dead. She was completely isolated. The figure began to move toward the door again, and Evelyn could hear its footsteps crunching through the gravel. Each step was deliberate, unnervingly slow, desperate. She grabbed a heavy iron poker from the fireplace and held it in front of her, the only thing she had for protection. The knocking resumed, louder and more insistent. Evelyn steeled herself and opened the door a crack, shining the flashlight through. The figure was no longer visible, but the scream persisted, now coming from inside the house. Evelyn swung the door open fully and searched the area, but there was nothing there, just the relentless rain and the dark, oppressive woods. She backed inside, closing the door with a thud. The screaming suddenly stopped. The silence was profound, almost more unsettling than the noise. Evelyn's flashlight flickered, and she heard a creak from above, as though someone was moving around in the attic. Her breath quickened. She had to investigate, but every step felt like wading through treacle. She climbed the creaky stairs, each step echoing in the dark silence. As she reached the attic door, she hesitated. The sound of movement was unmistakable now. Someone, or something, was definitely up there. Summoning all her courage, she opened the attic door. The attic was empty, save for old trunks and cobwebs. But in the corner, she noticed something disturbing, an old, weathered family photo album, lying open. The pages were smeared with something dark and red, and the faces in the photographs seemed to be staring directly at her. Suddenly, she felt a cold breath on her neck. She spun around, but there was no one there. The screaming resumed, now louder and closer. She turned the flashlight around frantically, but the attic remained empty. In a moment of sheer panic, Evelyn bolted down the stairs and out of the attic, heading for the front door. But as she reached it, she stopped dead in her tracks. The door was now covered in a thick layer of something, mud, or perhaps something darker. It was as if the storm itself had conspired to keep her in. A final, deafening scream filled the cottage. Evelyn collapsed to the floor, her flashlight flickering out. In the darkness, she could feel the presence drawing closer, could hear the breath of whatever was tormenting her, and then, just as abruptly as it had started, everything fell silent. Evelyn sat in the cold darkness, waiting for what would come next. The storm raged outside, but inside, it was as though a new storm had taken hold, one of terror and unspoken dread. In the morning light, Leo arrived to find the cottage eerily still. Evelyn was nowhere to be found, and the old family photo album lay open on the floor, its pages now blank. The rain had stopped, but the air was thick with an unsettling calm, as though something had been waiting for the storm to end, and somewhere in the woods, the echo of a final, tortured scream lingered in the wind. Evelyn's pulse hammered in her ears as she lay curled on the floor of the darkened living room. The oppressive silence after the scream was almost worse than the noise. She could barely make out the shapes of the furniture around her in the dim light of the dying embers in the fireplace. Every creak of the house seemed magnified, every shadow a potential threat. Desperate to find some form of reassurance or safety, Evelyn stumbled to her feet, her flashlight swinging wildly as she searched the room. The heavy rain continued to pound against the windows, each drop like a drumbeat amplifying her fear. She needed to find a way out, but the door was inexplicably sealed, and the windows were too high to escape through. She considered calling Leo again, but her phone was still out of service. As she paced the room, she noticed something odd. The old photo album on the floor, which she had seen in the attic, was now inexplicably lying open in the middle of the living room. The pages were still smeared with the dark substance, but now, images had begun to form on them, distorted faces and twisted figures that seemed to move and change as she looked at them. In a sudden burst of panic, Evelyn grabbed the album and threw it into the fire. The flames licked at the pages, and for a moment, it seemed as though the figures in the album were screaming as they burned. But the relief was short-lived. The screaming was still there, now a low, continuous moan that filled the house with a menacing presence. She ran to the windows, frantically trying to pry them open, but they were stuck fast. The storm outside had intensified, the wind howling like a living thing. Evelyn's breath came in shallow, rapid bursts as she looked around for another way out. Her eyes fell on the attic door again. If there was something in the attic that could explain what was happening, she had to go back up there. With a determined breath, Evelyn made her way to the attic. The stairs creaked under her weight, and the chill in the air grew more intense as she approached. The attic was still eerily empty, but something was different. The shadows seemed darker, more oppressive, and the temperature had dropped significantly. In the corner where she had seen the photo album before, there was now a strange, glowing object, a small, ornate box, half buried in the dust. Her curiosity overpowered her fear, and she approached it with trembling hands. The box was intricately carved with strange symbols and seemed to hum with a faint energy. Evelyn's fingers grazed the surface of the box, and a sudden jolt of cold electricity shot through her, making her gasp. Ignoring the sensation, she carefully lifted the lid. Inside, she found an assortment of old trinkets, a tarnished locket, a brittle letter, and a small, blood-stained doll. The letter was old and yellowed, its edges curling and disintegrating. Evelyn unfolded it carefully, her eyes scanning the faded ink. The letter was a desperate plea from someone who had lived in the cottage long ago. It spoke of a dark force that had taken hold of their family, a curse that bound them to the house. The final line was a chilling message: if you read this, know that the darkness has not left. It only waits for the right moment to claim another. A cold sweat broke out on Evelyn's forehead. She slammed the box shut, her mind racing. The presence that had tormented her seemed to be growing stronger. The moaning had become a series of guttural growls, echoing through the attic and reverberating through the walls. Suddenly, the growling stopped. The silence was broken by the sound of footsteps, heavy, deliberate steps coming from the attic door. Evelyn turned slowly, her flashlight flickering as she tried to pierce the darkness. She could see nothing, but the sensation of being watched was overwhelming. A shape appeared in the doorway, a dark figure with glowing eyes. Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. The figure stepped forward, and with each movement, it seemed to pull the darkness around it like a shroud. It was as if the very air was being sucked out of the room. The figure spoke in a voice that was both distant and close, echoing with a malevolent tone. "You have disturbed what was meant to be left alone." Evelyn backed away, her eyes wide with terror. She glanced around the attic for something, anything, that might help her. The figure advanced slowly, and Evelyn, driven by sheer instinct, grabbed the locket from the box and held it out as though it might offer some protection. The locket was cool to the touch, and as she opened it, a strange light emanated from within. The figure hesitated, its glowing eyes flickering as if it was struggling against the light. Evelyn took advantage of the momentary distraction and dashed for the attic stairs. She bolted down them, her mind racing with thoughts of escape. Reaching the living room, she grabbed the heavy poker from the fireplace and prepared to defend herself. The sound of the figure's growls grew louder as it descended the stairs, but Evelyn didn't wait to face it. She knew she had to get out of the cottage. She headed for the front door once more, but it was still sealed tight. Desperation clawed at her. She turned and saw a window on the far side of the room, the only one that seemed slightly ajar. She ran to it, pushing with all her strength until the window gave way and shattered outward. The rain poured in, but Evelyn didn't care. She climbed through the broken window and dropped into the wet, muddy grass. The storm drenched her instantly, but she didn't stop. She ran into the woods, the trees swaying violently in the storm, branches whipping her as she fled. Behind her, she could hear the figure's growls growing fainter, but the sense of being pursued never left her. She ran until she could no longer hear the storm or the growls, collapsing in exhaustion by the side of the road. When the dawn finally broke, Evelyn was found by a passing motorist, shivering and disoriented. She was taken to a nearby town, where she was given shelter and warmth. But even as she recounted her story to the authorities, the fear in her eyes was unmistakable. No one believed her fully, and when they sent a team to the cottage, they found nothing unusual. The house was empty, and the rain had washed away any evidence of the night's events. The cottage stood silent, a forlorn relic in the woods. Evelyn never returned to the cottage or spoke of that night again, but she remained haunted by what she experienced. The locket, which she had managed to keep despite her harrowing escape, was a constant reminder of the darkness that had almost claimed her. And sometimes, when the rain falls heavily and the wind howls through the trees, Evelyn can still hear the distant, echoing growls of the figure that waits in the dark corners of the world, forever bound to the cursed house in the woods. Second story. Tessa looked at the clock on the wall of the small, dimly lit bus station. The hour hand had just reached midnight, and the storm outside was growing more intense by the minute. Rain pelted the glass windows, and the wind howled through the empty parking lot, rattling the old metal sign that read, "Sheltonville, next bus in 1 hour." She sighed and sank into one of the cracked leather seats. The station was almost deserted, save for a few scattered passengers and a tired-looking attendant who had long since stopped pretending to be engaged. Tessa had missed her last bus home due to a delay at work, and now she was stuck here waiting for the next one. The only other passengers were a young couple huddled together in the corner, whispering softly, and an elderly man who sat in a faded blue coat, quietly staring at the rain outside. The hum of the fluorescent lights above was the only sound besides the steady drumming of the rain. Tessa pulled her coat tighter around herself. The temperature in the station was uncomfortably low, and a draft seemed to creep in from every corner. She glanced at the clock again, 11:55 p.m. Just one more hour until the next bus arrived, but it felt like an eternity. A sudden flicker of the lights caught her attention, and she looked up to see the attendant's disinterested gaze shift to the door. Tessa followed his gaze and saw a tall figure standing just outside the entrance, shrouded in the storm. The figure was drenched, its outline barely discernible through the sheets of rain. The door to the station creaked open, and the figure stepped inside. It was a man, tall and gaunt, with a wide-brimmed hat pulled low over his eyes. His coat was tattered, and he shook the rain from it as he walked in. Tessa's gaze lingered on him for a moment before she looked away, feeling a sudden, inexplicable unease. The man approached the counter, his movements slow and deliberate. The attendant barely acknowledged him, muttering a greeting and returning to his newspaper. The man didn't seem to notice or care. Instead, he walked to the corner of the station and sat down, his gaze fixed on the rain-slicked windows. Tessa tried to ignore him, focusing instead on her phone, hoping that some distraction might make the time pass faster. But her mind kept drifting back to the stranger. Something about him was off, his presence felt out of place, almost malevolent. The young couple in the corner had stopped talking, and the elderly man's gaze had shifted from the rain to the newcomer. An uneasy silence settled over the station. Tessa's fingers trembled slightly as she scrolled through her phone, trying to drown out the creeping sense of dread. Minutes ticked by slowly, and the clock now read 12:30 a.m. The storm outside showed no sign of letting up. Tessa glanced at the stranger again, noting that he had removed his hat and was now holding it in his lap. His face was partially obscured by shadow, but she could make out a pale, gaunt complexion with hollow eyes that seemed to reflect the dim light of the station. Without warning, the power flickered and then went out, plunging the station into darkness. A collective gasp rose from the few passengers, and the overhead emergency lights flickered on, casting a sickly yellow glow over the room. Tessa's heart raced. She could still make out the silhouette of the stranger, now standing up and moving toward the middle of the room. The wind howled louder, and the sound of the rain against the windows grew deafening. The atmosphere in the station grew thick with tension. The emergency lights cast long, eerie shadows, and Tessa saw that the man had stopped in the middle of the floor, his head tilted as though listening for something. The young couple huddled closer together, and the elderly man's eyes were wide with fear. The stranger began to speak, his voice a low, rasping whisper that barely reached Tessa's ears. "The bus, it's not coming. Not tonight." His words sent a shiver down her spine. She looked around at the other passengers, who seemed just as unsettled. The attendant had disappeared, leaving the station eerily quiet except for the howling storm outside. "What do you mean?" the young woman asked, her voice trembling. The stranger didn't answer immediately. Instead, he took a slow, deliberate step toward the couple. Tessa noticed the change in the man's demeanor, his movements had become smoother, almost predatory. Tessa's instincts screamed at her to leave, but the doors were locked, and the storm outside was too fierce to consider venturing out into it. She felt trapped, her anxiety mounting with each passing second. Suddenly, the stranger's hat fell to the floor, and Tessa saw his face clearly for the first time. It was a horrifying sight, his eyes were hollow sockets, and his skin was stretched tight over a skull-like structure. The sight was enough to make her gasp. The elderly man, shaking, finally spoke. "We're stuck here, aren't we? He's not real." The stranger turned to face him, a slow, deliberate movement that seemed almost theatrical. "Real or not, it makes no difference. The storm will keep you here, and I will be waiting." A loud crash from the direction of the windows made everyone jump. Tessa saw a dark figure outside, moving rapidly through the rain. She could barely make out its features, but it seemed to be another person, or something else entirely, closing in on the station. Panic surged through her. She turned to the young couple, who were now clutching each other tightly. "We have to find a way out," she said urgently. "We can't stay here." The power flickered again, and the lights went out completely. The only source of illumination was the occasional flash of lightning outside, casting brief, ghostly shadows across the walls. In the darkness, Tessa heard the stranger's voice again, closer this time. The storm doesn't end until it has claimed what it wants. The fear was palpable now, and Tessa could hear the young woman sobbing quietly. The elderly man was muttering to himself, while the stranger's footsteps seemed to echo around the station, getting closer and closer. Tessa's heart pounded as she moved cautiously toward the door, her hands groping in the dark. She tried the handle, but it was locked tight. The windows were still sealed, and the storm raged on outside, making any attempt at escape seem hopeless. Suddenly, the emergency lights flickered back on, and the stranger was nowhere to be seen. The station was silent except for the sound of the rain. Tessa's breath came in ragged gasps as she looked around, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The elderly man was slumped in his seat, his eyes closed, while the young couple was huddled together, looking around with wide, terrified eyes. The clock on the wall showed that nearly an hour had passed since the power outage began. The bus was supposed to arrive soon, but Tessa had little faith that it would. The station door suddenly burst open, and the storm seemed to pour in with a deafening roar. The figure outside was now clearly visible, a gaunt, shadowy figure that seemed to be part of the storm itself. Tessa could see that it was moving with purpose, its eyes glowing with an unsettling light. As the figure advanced, Tessa felt a sudden, overwhelming sense of dread. She turned to the young couple and the elderly man. "We have to go now," she shouted over the storm's roar. The young woman nodded, tears streaming down her face, while the elderly man struggled to his feet. The storm was now inside the station, the wind howling and the rain pouring in. Tessa and the others made a desperate dash for the door, but the shadowy figure was already between them and freedom. Tessa reached the door first, but as she tried to push it open, she felt a cold, invisible force holding it shut. She looked back, her eyes wide with fear, as the figure's presence loomed over them. The young couple was now huddled in a corner, their screams lost in the cacophony of the storm. In a final, desperate attempt, Tessa grabbed the elderly man and pulled him away from the figure. With a last burst of energy, she threw herself against the door, and it finally gave way. They stumbled out into the storm, the rain battering them as they fled down the darkened road. The storm raged on, but Tessa didn't stop. She ran as fast as she could, the howling wind and torrential rain making it nearly impossible to see. The road ahead was unclear, but she knew she had to keep moving. Behind her, the station and its horrors were left in the storm's wake. When Tessa finally collapsed in a nearby town, soaked and exhausted, she looked back at the road. The storm had passed, and the darkness was beginning to lift. The bus station was nowhere in sight, swallowed by the storm and the night. The next morning, Tessa found herself alone, the elderly man and the young couple nowhere to be seen. The storm had left no trace of their ordeal, and the bus station had vanished, as if it had never existed. Only the memory of that night remained, a chilling reminder of the last bus and the horrors that had been waiting. As Tessa left the town and returned to her life, she carried with her the knowledge that sometimes, the worst horrors are not the ones we see but the ones that linger in the shadows. Third story. 1 hour of rainy alone at night horror stories. The small town of Everwood was known for its picturesque landscapes and serene, almost idyllic atmosphere. Nestled between rolling hills and dense forests, it was a place where time seemed to stand still. That was, until the strange occurrences began. Laura had recently moved to Everwood, seeking a fresh start after a series of personal setbacks. It was a quiet town, perfect for someone looking to escape the chaos of city life. She had rented a small cabin on the edge of the forest, an area known for its natural beauty and peaceful solitude. Little did she know, the forest held secrets that would challenge her sense of reality. One evening, as Laura sat in her cozy cabin by the fire, a storm rolled in. The wind picked up, howling through the trees and making the walls of the cabin creak. The rain battered the windows, creating a rhythmic, soothing sound that seemed oddly comforting despite the storm's ferocity. Laura was enjoying a book when a sudden, loud crack of thunder made her jump. She glanced out the window, but the storm had enveloped everything in a thick curtain of rain. The world outside was a blur of dark shadows and relentless downpour. At precisely 11 p.m., the power went out. The cabin was plunged into darkness, save for the dim glow of her lantern. Laura cursed softly, then went to retrieve some candles from the kitchen. As she fumbled in the dark, she noticed something unusual, a faint, eerie light coming from the forest. Laura was about to dismiss it as a trick of the storm when she saw it again. The light was not the flash of lightning but a steady, pulsing glow that seemed to be moving deeper into the woods. Her curiosity got the better of her. After all, Everwood was a quiet town, and there hadn't been any stories of strange phenomena, at least none that she had heard. Grabbing a flashlight and her rain jacket, Laura stepped out into the storm. The rain soaked through her jacket almost immediately, but she pressed on, following the pulsing light through the trees. The forest was eerily silent, save for the rain and the occasional distant rumble of thunder. The light led her deeper into the forest, and the trees seemed to close in around her. The path was barely visible, and the storm made every step treacherous. Laura's flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the forest floor and casting long, unsettling shadows on the trees. After what felt like an eternity, the light stopped. Laura found herself in a small clearing, surrounded by towering trees. The pulsing glow was now a soft, greenish light emanating from the center of the clearing. In the middle of the light was an old, gnarled tree with an unusual pattern of runes carved into its trunk. Laura approached the tree cautiously, her heart pounding. The runes were intricate, their shapes twisting and turning in ways that seemed almost alive. The green light seemed to pulse in time with a low, rhythmic hum that resonated through the clearing. As Laura examined the runes, a sudden chill swept through the clearing. The temperature dropped sharply, and she could see her breath misting in the cold air. The hum grew louder, almost as though it was coming from within the tree itself. Laura took a step back, her flashlight shaking in her hand. The light revealed something disturbing. Roots from the gnarled tree seemed to move, shifting and writhing like living tendrils. The ground around the tree was uneven, and she could see what appeared to be small, skeletal remains half buried in the soil. Her unease turned to terror as the hum became a cacophony of whispers. They were faint, almost imperceptible, but they carried an unmistakable tone of anguish. The whispers grew louder, swirling around her, and Laura felt an overwhelming sense of dread. Suddenly, the light from the tree flared brightly, blinding her. Laura stumbled back, her flashlight falling to the ground. When the light dimmed, she saw that the clearing was no longer empty. Figures emerged from the shadows, shadowy, indistinct forms that seemed to drift towards her. Laura tried to move, but her legs felt like lead. The figures drew closer, and she could make out their faces, pale and distorted, with hollow eyes that seemed to pierce through her. The whispers grew into a chorus of mournful wails. In a panic, Laura turned and fled. The figures followed her, their whispers becoming a relentless barrage of voices that filled her mind. The forest seemed to shift and twist, the trees closing in around her as she ran. She stumbled through the darkness, the rain stinging her face. Every step seemed to pull her deeper into the forest, away from the safety of her cabin. The whispers grew louder, their tone increasingly desperate and accusing. Laura's flashlight flickered, then died completely. She was left in utter darkness, the forest now a nightmarish labyrinth. Her breath came in ragged gasps as she pushed through the rain and mud, her mind racing with fear and exhaustion. After what felt like hours, Laura burst out of the forest and into a clearing she didn't recognize. The storm was still raging, but the oppressive feeling had lifted. The figures and the whispers were gone. Panting heavily, she collapsed to the ground, her heart pounding. As she lay there, trying to regain her composure, she noticed something strange. The clearing was perfectly still, and the rain seemed to be falling in a slow, rhythmic pattern. The ground was eerily dry around her, and the trees stood silent, their shadows still and unmoving. Laura looked around, trying to find her way back to her cabin. The storm had lessened, and the forest seemed to have returned to its normal state. She could see the faint glow of her cabin's lights in the distance. With a final, weary glance at the clearing, Laura made her way back to her cabin. When she arrived, she found that the power had been restored. She collapsed onto her bed, exhausted and shaken by the night's events. In the days that followed, Laura tried to put the experience behind her. The forest was quiet, and the strange occurrences seemed to be nothing more than a product of her overactive imagination combined with the storm. But she couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. Occasionally, on particularly stormy nights, Laura would catch a glimpse of a faint, greenish light in the distance. She would remember the whispers and the figures, and the unease would return. She knew that the forest held secrets she was not meant to understand. And though she continued to live in Everwood, she never ventured into the forest again. The clearing and its haunting light remained a silent reminder of the night she had faced the darkness within, and of the forest that seemed to harbor secrets best left undiscovered. Fourth story. The small, isolated town of Hollow Creek had always been surrounded by an air of mystery. Nestled in a remote valley and bordered by dense, ancient woods, it was a place where the past seemed to linger long after the present had moved on. Stories of hauntings and strange occurrences were common, but they were usually dismissed as local lore. Emily had recently moved to Hollow Creek to escape the hustle and bustle of city life. She had rented a quaint, old house on the edge of town, a charming Victorian with creaky floors and a wraparound porch. It was the perfect escape, or so she thought. One night, as Emily settled into her new home, a violent thunderstorm rolled through the valley. The wind howled through the trees, and rain lashed against the windows. The storm was intense, but Emily found comfort in the rhythmic patter of the rain and the warm glow of her living room lamp. As the clock struck midnight, a loud crack of thunder caused Emily to jump. She was about to turn back to her book when she heard a faint, echoing sound, a soft, melodic tune carried on the wind. It was a music box tune, delicate and eerie, and it seemed to be coming from outside. Curiosity piqued, Emily wrapped herself in a blanket and went to the window. The storm obscured her view, but the music continued, growing louder and more insistent. She squinted through the rain and saw a dim light flickering at the edge of the woods. The music box melody wove through the storm, a haunting contrast to the storm's fury. Unable to resist the pull of the mysterious tune, Emily grabbed a flashlight and a raincoat. She stepped out into the storm, the rain soaking through her coat almost immediately. The wind was biting, and the music seemed to guide her deeper into the forest. The dense woods were silent except for the roar of the storm and the distant music. Emily followed the sound, the trees looming tall and dark around her. The path was nearly invisible under the torrential rain, but she pressed on, drawn by the haunting melody. After what felt like an eternity, Emily reached a small clearing. In the center of the clearing stood an old, decrepit gazebo, its once white paint now peeling and weathered. The music was louder here, and Emily could see a flickering light inside the gazebo. As she approached, she saw an antique music box sitting on a pedestal in the center of the gazebo. It was old and ornate, with intricate designs and a small key. The melody was coming from this music box, its tune strangely beautiful but unsettling. Emily stepped closer, her flashlight illuminating the music box. The key was twisted, and the music played on a continuous loop. She hesitated for a moment, then reached out to stop the music. As her fingers touched the box, the melody abruptly ceased, and an eerie silence fell over the clearing. A cold shiver ran down Emily's spine. She turned to leave, but the wind seemed to pick up, and the rain intensified. The storm's fury was now accompanied by a low, mournful wail, echoing through the forest. The sound was chilling, almost as if it was crying out in despair. Suddenly, the temperature dropped, and Emily could see her breath misting in the air. The gazebo's light flickered, and the figures of shadowy apparitions began to materialize around her. Their forms were indistinct, but their presence was undeniably unsettling. Emily's heart raced as she looked around, the whispers of the apparitions mingling with the storm's roar. The figures seemed to move closer, their features becoming clearer with each passing second. They were ghostly figures dressed in old-fashioned clothing, their faces twisted in expressions of sorrow and fear. One figure, a woman dressed in a tattered gown, stepped forward. Her eyes were hollow, and she reached out toward Emily with a trembling hand. The sight was both tragic and terrifying. Desperate to escape, Emily turned and fled from the gazebo. The storm raged around her, and the apparitions followed, their wails growing louder and more anguished. She ran through the forest, the rain blurring her vision and the wind nearly knocking her off balance. The path seemed to twist and turn, leading her deeper into the woods. The once familiar forest now felt like a labyrinth of darkness and despair. Emily's breath came in ragged gasps, and she could hear the whispering voices closing in on her. Finally, she stumbled out of the woods and onto a small road leading back to town. The storm was still raging, but the apparitions had vanished. Emily didn't stop running until she reached the safety of her house. Shaking and soaked to the bone, she slammed the door shut behind her. The music box's melody was still echoing in her mind, a haunting reminder of what she had encountered. She tried to calm herself, but the sense of dread lingered. In the days that followed, Emily tried to make sense of what she had experienced. She spoke to some of the locals, hoping to find an explanation. To her surprise, she learned that the gazebo and the music box were tied to an old legend about a tragic event in Hollow Creek's history. Many years ago, a young woman had been engaged to a local man. On the night of their wedding, a violent storm had struck, and the woman had vanished. The townspeople believed that she had been lost in the storm, and her music box, a cherished gift from her fiancé, was found abandoned in the gazebo. The story went that the woman's spirit had never left, and her sorrowful wails could still be heard on stormy nights. The apparition that Emily had encountered was said to be the young woman, forever bound to the gazebo and the music box. Emily was disturbed but found some solace in knowing that her experience was part of a larger story. She continued to live in Hollow Creek, but she avoided the forest and the gazebo. The stormy nights remained unsettling, and the sound of a distant music box melody would sometimes send shivers down her spine. The legend of the Phantom of Hollow Creek continued to haunt her, a chilling reminder of the night she had ventured into the forest and come face to face with the sorrowful spirit of a lost bride. Fifth story. The old lighthouse at the edge of Blackwood Bay had long been abandoned. Its once brilliant light now lay dormant, shrouded in the shadows of time. Locals spoke of the lighthouse in hushed tones, weaving tales of strange happenings and eerie lights seen in the dead of night. But for the most part, the stories were dismissed as mere folklore, until the night of the storm. Grace, a young marine biologist with a passion for history, had arrived in Blackwood Bay to study the local marine life. The town's charm and its historical sites intrigued her, but the lighthouse, with its dark reputation, held an irresistible allure. It was said that a century ago, the lighthouse keeper had vanished under mysterious circumstances, leaving only an enigmatic journal behind. As dusk fell and the storm rolled in, Grace found herself drawn to the lighthouse. The wind howled through the trees, and the rain came down in torrents. She had hoped to explore the lighthouse by daylight, but the approaching storm had changed her plans. With a flashlight and a sense of reckless curiosity, she made her way to the edge of the cliff where the lighthouse stood. The structure loomed against the stormy sky, its silhouette both imposing and forlorn. Grace approached cautiously, her heart pounding in anticipation. The heavy door creaked open with surprising ease, and she stepped inside, the warmth of the lantern's light cutting through the oppressive darkness. The interior was as she had imagined, dusty and decayed. The air was thick with the smell of mildew and old wood. Grace's flashlight beam cut through the gloom, revealing cobwebs draped over the old furnishings and a spiral staircase leading up to the lantern room. As she climbed the stairs, the storm outside seemed to intensify, the wind whipping around the lighthouse and rattling the windows. The sound of the storm was almost deafening, and Grace felt a growing sense of unease. The lighthouse had an unsettling stillness to it, interrupted only by the occasional groan of the old building. Reaching the top, Grace entered the lantern room. The glass windows provided a panoramic view of the storm-tossed bay. The wind howled around the structure, and the rain lashed against the windows. Grace moved to a small desk in the corner of the room, where she hoped to find the keeper's journal. The desk was cluttered with old papers, photographs, and dusty artifacts. Grace carefully sifted through the items, her flashlight illuminating the faded ink on the pages. The journal was there, bound in worn leather and filled with pages of handwritten notes and sketches. As Grace opened the journal, a chill swept through the room. She shivered despite the warmth of her coat. The journal's entries were filled with descriptions of strange occurrences, disembodied whispers, shadowy figures, and inexplicable lights seen from the lighthouse. One entry stood out, written in a hurried scrawl: "The watcher comes with the storm. It waits in the shadows, and its eyes are everywhere. I fear it will take me next." Grace's curiosity was piqued. She read on, discovering that the lighthouse keeper had been obsessed with the idea of a malevolent presence, a shadowy figure that appeared during storms. According to the journal, the figure seemed to watch the keeper with a haunting intensity. As Grace continued reading, the wind outside howled louder, and the storm seemed to grow more intense. She glanced out the window and noticed something unsettling. Amidst the chaotic rain and darkness, there was a figure standing on the cliff's edge, its shape barely discernible through the storm. Her heart raced. The figure was tall and indistinct, shrouded in the storm's fury. Grace strained her eyes, but the figure remained a blur, standing motionless as the storm raged around it. She tried to dismiss it as a trick of the light or a figment of her imagination, but the unease remained. Suddenly, the lantern room's temperature dropped sharply. Grace could see her breath misting in the cold air. The wind howled louder, and the old building creaked ominously. She felt a presence, a weight in the room that she couldn't explain. Grace turned her attention back to the journal, hoping it might offer some explanation or comfort. But as she read the final entries, she realized the situation was growing more sinister. The last entry described a final encounter with the Watcher: "It has come for me. I see its shadow on the wall, and I know it will take me." As Grace finished reading, the flashlight flickered and died, plunging her into darkness. Panic surged through her. She fumbled for her backup flashlight, her hands trembling. When the light finally came back on, she saw something that made her blood run cold. In the dim beam, the shadows on the wall appeared to move. They twisted and contorted, forming the indistinct shape of a figure that seemed to be watching her with malevolent intent. Grace's heart pounded as she turned, but the lantern room was empty except for the old desk and the scattered papers. The storm outside was deafening, and the wind howled with an almost sentient fury. Grace tried to steady her nerves and gather her belongings. She needed to leave, but the thought of facing the storm outside while being pursued by an unseen presence terrified her. As she made her way down the spiral staircase, she heard a faint, echoing whisper. It was as if the shadows themselves were speaking, their voices mingling with the storm's roar. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and Grace felt a cold breath on the back of her neck. Desperate to escape, Grace stumbled down the stairs, her flashlight casting erratic beams of light. She reached the ground floor and ran toward the door, but it was stuck. The storm had forced it shut, and she struggled to open it, her panic rising. The whispers grew louder, and Grace felt a cold hand grip her shoulder. She spun around, but no one was there. The sensation was fleeting, but it left her paralyzed with fear. She forced herself to focus and finally managed to open the door. The storm hit her with full force as she stepped outside. Rain pelted her, and the wind nearly knocked her off her feet. Grace ran toward the edge of the cliff, where she had seen the figure. Through the rain and darkness, she saw it again, a shadowy silhouette standing motionless at the precipice. Grace's breath came in ragged gasps as she neared the figure. The storm was relentless, and the shadows seemed to dance around her. She reached out toward the figure, but it dissipated into the storm, leaving her alone at the cliff's edge. Heart racing, Grace stumbled back toward the lighthouse. She felt as though she were being followed, the whispers of the watcher echoing in her ears. The storm seemed to be closing in on her, the darkness pressing in from all sides. When she finally reached her car, she got inside and started the engine. The storm was still raging, but the car provided a brief respite from the chaos. Grace drove away from the lighthouse, her mind racing with the night's events. Back in town, Grace tried to make sense of what had happened. She spoke to the locals, hoping for answers, but they only confirmed what she had read in the journal. The lighthouse was known for its hauntings, and the watcher was a well-known legend. Grace left Blackwood Bay the next morning, unable to shake the feeling that something had followed her. The lighthouse and its shadowy watcher remained a haunting memory, a reminder of the night she had faced the darkness and encountered the inexplicable presence that watched from the storm. Sixth story. Tucked away in the hills of a quiet countryside was the small village of Elderton. Its cobblestone streets and ancient homes seemed untouched by time. The village was known for its historical charm and serene atmosphere, but it had a peculiar tradition. Every year, on the last night of July, Elderton observed an hour-long event known as the Vanishing Hour. The tradition was shrouded in mystery and held a particular allure for newcomers. The villagers spoke of it with a mix of reverence and fear. The story went that on this one night, between midnight and 1 a.m., anything that wasn't properly secured would vanish without a trace. It was a phenomenon that had perplexed outsiders and locals alike for generations. Amelia, a writer seeking inspiration, had recently arrived in Elderton to experience the village's unique charm firsthand. Intrigued by the legends, she was determined to uncover the truth behind the vanishing hour. She rented a cozy cottage on the edge of town and spent her days exploring the village and its surroundings. The night of the vanishing hour arrived, and Amelia was both excited and anxious. She had spent the day securing her belongings, placing her valuables in a locked chest and ensuring that nothing could be easily removed. As the clock ticked closer to midnight, she prepared to witness the event for herself. At precisely 11:45 p.m., Amelia settled into her armchair with a cup of tea and a notebook. She planned to document her observations and write a detailed account of the night's events. The cottage was quiet, the only sounds coming from the occasional crackle of the fireplace and the distant rustling of leaves outside. The clock struck midnight, and Amelia began her observations. She noted the silence that seemed to settle over the village, the way the air felt thick and expectant. The darkness outside was impenetrable, and the wind carried an eerie chill. As she scribbled in her notebook, she noticed a strange sensation, as if the world had become slightly unreal. The minutes ticked by slowly, and Amelia kept her eyes on the clock. Her curiosity grew, but so did a creeping sense of unease. The quiet was almost oppressive, and she felt as though she were being watched. She glanced around the cottage, her gaze falling on the items she had so meticulously secured. At exactly 12:30 a.m., Amelia heard a faint noise from the kitchen. It was a soft, scraping sound, almost as if something was being dragged across the floor. Her heart skipped a beat, and she rose to investigate. The kitchen was dark, and she fumbled for the light switch. The room was empty, but a chill ran through her as she noticed that her kitchen clock had stopped ticking. Amelia shook off the unease and returned to her chair. She resumed writing, but her concentration was broken. The scratching sound came again, this time louder, accompanied by a low, muffled thud. The noises seemed to come from the attic. With trepidation, Amelia made her way to the attic. The wooden steps creaked under her weight, and the darkness seemed to envelop her. She reached the attic door and slowly opened it. The attic was filled with old furniture and dusty boxes. The faint light from her flashlight revealed nothing out of the ordinary, but the scratching had stopped. As Amelia turned to leave, she heard a sudden, loud bang from behind her. She whirled around, her flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The attic seemed to shift, the shadows on the walls taking on strange, distorted shapes. She felt a presence in the room, an oppressive weight that made her skin crawl. Panicking, Amelia hurried back down the stairs. As she descended, the house seemed to change. The walls felt closer, the rooms seemed to shrink, and the air grew colder. She stumbled into the living room and noticed something terrifying. The clock on the wall had stopped at 12:59 a.m. With trembling hands, Amelia checked her watch. It was 1 a.m., but the minute hand on the clock in the living room remained frozen. Her heart raced as she realized that the vanishing hour was supposed to end at this exact moment, but something was off. She hurried to check the rest of the house. Her belongings were in place, but the strange sense of displacement continued. The quiet was more profound, and the shadows seemed to move of their own accord. As she checked her bedroom, she noticed something horrifying. Her reflection in the mirror was distorted, its eyes wide and fearful. Desperate to understand what was happening, Amelia grabbed her notebook and tried to document her observations, but the words on the page seemed to blur and shift. The house felt like it was closing in on her, and she felt an overwhelming sense of dread. Suddenly, the lights flickered, and the temperature in the room dropped. Amelia saw her breath misting in the cold air. The shadows on the walls grew darker and more menacing. A low, guttural whisper echoed through the room, sending chills down her spine. At that moment, Amelia realized that she was not alone. The whispers grew louder, becoming a chorus of disembodied voices. The shadows seemed to coalesce into a single, dark figure that hovered near the ceiling, its eyes glowing with an otherworldly light. The figure moved closer, its form shifting and undulating as if made of pure darkness. Amelia's fear reached its peak, and she felt paralyzed, unable to move or scream. The figure's eyes locked onto hers, and she felt a cold, malevolent force pressing against her. With a final, desperate effort, Amelia grabbed her flashlight and shone it directly at the figure. The beam cut through the darkness, and the figure recoiled, its form dissipating into the shadows. The room's temperature slowly returned to normal, and the whispers faded. Amelia collapsed to the floor, her heart pounding in her chest. She glanced at the clock, and to her relief, it was moving again. The vanishing hour had ended, but the sense of dread lingered. As the storm subsided and the first light of dawn crept through the windows, Amelia packed her belongings and prepared to leave Elderton. She couldn't explain what had happened during the vanishing hour, but she knew that the village's tradition held a deeper truth than she had ever imagined. The events of that night left a lasting impression on her. She wrote about her experience, capturing the terror and the mystery of the vanishing hour. The village of Elderton continued its tradition, its secrets preserved in the shadows, and Amelia left with a haunting memory of the night she had faced the unknown. Seventh story. The Morrow house had stood empty for decades, its once grand facade now shrouded in ivy and decay. It was a relic of a bygone era, a Victorian mansion perched on a hill overlooking the sleepy town of Westbrook. The house had become a local legend, whispered about in fearful tones, and avoided by all but the most daring of souls. Jenna, a young historian with a penchant for the paranormal, had heard about the Morrow house from her colleagues. Intrigued by its dark history and the stories of unexplained phenomena, she decided to spend a night there, hoping to uncover the truth behind the rumors. She arrived just before dusk, the storm clouds gathering ominously overhead. The mansion was even more imposing up close. Its once elegant architecture was now marred by weathered wood and broken windows. Jenna unlocked the creaky front door and stepped into the foyer, the air thick with dust and the musty smell of neglect. The dim light from her lantern cast long shadows on the walls, highlighting the faded grandeur of the house. As Jenna explored the house, she found remnants of its past, old photographs, tattered furniture, and an ornate staircase that creaked with every step. The grand chandelier above the foyer was covered in cobwebs, and the walls were adorned with peeling wallpaper. Despite its state of disrepair, there was an undeniable allure to the mansion. With nightfall approaching, Jenna set up her equipment in the parlor, a series of cameras, audio recorders, and a temperature gauge. She wanted to document any paranormal activity, should it occur. As she worked, the storm outside began in earnest, the wind howling through the trees and rain lashing against the windows. At exactly 11 p.m., Jenna settled into an armchair with a notebook, prepared to record her observations. The storm outside was deafening, and the power had flickered off, leaving her in near-complete darkness save for the dim glow of her lantern. The house creaked and groaned with every gust of wind, creating an eerie atmosphere. As the clock approached midnight, Jenna noticed a sudden drop in temperature. Her breath misted in the air, and she could see her breath fogging up in the cold. She glanced at the temperature gauge. It had dropped several degrees in a matter of minutes. The cold seemed to emanate from the direction of the old staircase. Curious and slightly unnerved, Jenna decided to investigate. She climbed the stairs, the wooden steps creaking beneath her feet. The second floor was just as neglected as the rest of the house, with cobwebs hanging from the corners and dust covering every surface. At the end of the hallway was a door slightly ajar. Jenna pushed it open, revealing a large bedroom furnished with antique furniture. In the center of the room was a large, four-poster bed draped with faded curtains. On the bed was an old journal, its leather cover cracked and worn. Jenna approached the bed and picked up the journal. The pages were yellowed and fragile, filled with elegant handwriting. As she read, she discovered that the journal belonged to Elizabeth Morrow, the last resident of the house. The entries detailed Elizabeth's life, her fears, and the strange occurrences she had experienced, noises in the night, flickering lights, and a persistent feeling of being watched. One entry stood out: "I hear footsteps in the hall at night. The shadows seem to move on their own. I fear that I am not alone in this house." As Jenna read, the storm outside intensified, and the wind howled louder. The room's temperature dropped further, and Jenna felt a chill that seemed to seep into her bones. The old grandfather clock in the corner struck midnight, its chimes echoing through the mansion. Suddenly, Jenna heard a noise, a soft, almost imperceptible rustling coming from the corner of the room. She turned her flashlight toward the sound, but there was nothing there. The rustling continued, growing louder and more insistent. It sounded as though someone, or something, was moving around in the room with her. Jenna's heart raced as she scanned the room with her flashlight. Shadows danced on the walls, and the temperature gauge continued to plummet. The rustling grew more frantic, and Jenna could see a figure, a dark shape, moving in the corner of her vision. Desperate to understand what was happening, Jenna set up her camera and audio recorder, hoping to capture any evidence of paranormal activity. As she worked, the figure became clearer, taking on a more defined shape, a translucent, ghostly woman dressed in Victorian attire. Her eyes were hollow, and her expression was one of sorrow and despair. The apparition seemed to glide toward Jenna, its presence cold and oppressive. Jenna felt a powerful wave of dread wash over her. The figure raised a hand, pointing towards the doorway. The rustling sound grew louder, and Jenna could hear faint whispers, as if voices were speaking in a language she couldn't understand. The whispers became clearer, forming words that chilled Jenna to the bone: "Help us, leave this place." Panicked, Jenna grabbed her equipment and fled the room. The hallway was dark and labyrinthine, the shadows shifting and moving as if they were alive. She stumbled down the stairs, her flashlight flickering as she descended. The storm outside was raging at its peak, and the wind howled like a living entity. In the foyer, Jenna saw that the front door was now ajar, swinging slightly with the wind. The temperature in the house had dropped to an unbearable chill, and the whispers were now a cacophony of anguished voices. Jenna felt an icy grip on her shoulder and spun around, but there was no one there. The whispers grew louder, becoming a relentless chorus of pleas and warnings. Jenna rushed to gather her belongings, her hands shaking with fear. She could hear footsteps following her, echoing through the empty halls. The shadows seemed to close in around her, pressing in with a suffocating intensity. With a final burst of adrenaline, Jenna burst through the front door and into the storm. The rain lashed against her, and the wind nearly knocked her off her feet. She ran to her car, her breath coming in ragged gasps, and started the engine. As she drove away from the Morrow house, Jenna glanced in the rearview mirror. The mansion stood in the distance, its silhouette a dark and menacing shape against the stormy sky. The whispers and shadows of the house seemed to linger in her mind, a haunting reminder of the night she had faced the unknown. The Morrow house remained an enigma, its secrets locked within its decaying walls. Jenna's experience became a chilling chapter in the house's long history, and the whispers of Elizabeth Morrow and the other restless souls continued to echo through the empty rooms, waiting for someone brave, or foolish, enough to listen. 8th story. Nestled in the rolling hills of the countryside, the Wrenwood Orchard was renowned for its lush fruit trees and idyllic scenery. It was a place of tranquility and natural beauty, attracting visitors from near and far who came to pick apples and enjoy the picturesque landscape. However, there was one peculiarity about Wrenwood Orchard that locals whispered about but rarely discussed openly: the orchard had an unsettling history of silence during storms. According to local lore, the orchard was haunted by a spirit known as the Silent Keeper, a mysterious figure said to appear whenever a storm approached. The silence that fell over the orchard during these storms was said to be unsettling, with even the wind and rain seeming to vanish, leaving an oppressive quiet. Sophia, a young journalist with a keen interest in folklore, had come to Wrenwood to investigate the strange occurrences. She had heard the stories and was eager to experience the phenomenon for herself. Arriving at the orchard just before nightfall, she was greeted by the owner, Mr. Bennett, an elderly man with a kind smile and a weathered face. "The orchard's always been quiet during storms," Mr. Bennett said, his voice tinged with an accent from another time. "But there's more to it than folks let on. You're welcome to stay the night, but I advise you to leave before the storm hits." Sophia assured Mr. Bennett she would be careful and set up her equipment in a small cottage on the orchard's edge. The storm was expected to arrive around midnight, and Sophia planned to document the event. As the sun set, the orchard took on a serene but eerie quality, with the trees casting long shadows in the fading light. By 11:30 p.m., dark clouds gathered ominously above. The wind began to pick up, rustling the leaves and bringing a chill to the air. Sophia's excitement was tempered by a growing sense of unease. She had set up her cameras and audio recorders in the cottage, prepared for what might come. As midnight approached, the first drops of rain began to fall. Sophia could hear the distant rumble of thunder and the occasional flash of lightning. She took one last walk around the orchard, her flashlight cutting through the darkness. The trees stood silent, their branches swaying in the wind. The atmosphere felt heavy, as if the air itself was waiting for something. At exactly midnight, the storm seemed to intensify. Rain poured down in sheets, and the wind howled through the trees. Yet, as the clock struck 12, an uncanny silence fell over the orchard. The rain seemed to slow, and the wind died down to a whisper. Sophia was startled by the abrupt change. It was as if the storm had been cut off abruptly. Sophia returned to the cottage, where the silence was even more profound. The sound of the storm had vanished entirely, leaving an eerie quiet that was almost deafening. The audio recorders picked up nothing but static, and the temperature in the cottage seemed to drop. Sophia felt a cold shiver run down her spine. The silence was oppressive, and Sophia's attempts to document it were thwarted by the lack of sound. She wandered through the orchard, her flashlight casting long, wavering shadows. As she walked, she noticed something strange. The trees seemed to be leaning toward her, their branches almost reaching out in a menacing way. A flash of lightning illuminated the orchard, revealing a figure standing among the trees. The figure was tall and indistinct, cloaked in shadow. Sophia's heart raced as she tried to focus her flashlight on the figure, but it vanished as quickly as it had appeared. She stood still, her breath visible in the cold air. The silence returned, more profound than before. Sophia could hear the faintest rustling of leaves, but it was as if the world outside the orchard had ceased to exist. She felt an overwhelming sense of being watched, and the atmosphere seemed charged with a foreboding energy. Suddenly, Sophia heard a faint whisper, as if someone was speaking just out of earshot. The words were indistinguishable, but they carried an air of urgency. She turned in every direction, but the orchard was still and silent. The only sounds were the occasional creak of the trees and the distant rumble of thunder. As she continued her search, Sophia stumbled upon an old wooden gate at the edge of the orchard. It was partially hidden by overgrown vines and seemed out of place. She approached the gate, her flashlight revealing a rusted sign that read, "The Silent Orchard, Trespassers Beware." The gate was slightly ajar, and Sophia pushed it open. Beyond the gate was a small, neglected graveyard, its headstones weathered and cracked. The sight sent a chill through her. She realized that the graveyard was not mentioned in any of the local accounts she had read. It was a hidden part of the orchard, concealed from view. As she explored the graveyard, she noticed that the graves were all old and seemed to belong to people from a bygone era. The names on the headstones were faded, but one grave stood out. It was larger and more ornate than the others, with a marble cross and a plaque that read, "Here lies William Wren, the founder of the orchard." The air grew colder around the grave, and Sophia felt a sudden pressure on her chest. The whispers grew louder, and the shadows around her seemed to darken. She glanced up and saw the figure again, now standing by the grave. It was a spectral figure, dressed in old-fashioned clothing, with hollow eyes that seemed to pierce through the darkness. Sophia's heart pounded as she approached the figure. The whispers were now distinct, forming words that she could understand: "Help US, release US." The figure raised a hand toward the grave, and Sophia felt a surge of cold energy. She knew she had to do something but wasn't sure what. Desperate to understand, she took out her notebook and began to write down everything she had experienced. The whispers grew more urgent, and the figure seemed to be trying to convey a message. In a moment of clarity, Sophia realized that the figure was trying to communicate something about the orchard's history, perhaps a hidden truth or a forgotten story. She looked around the graveyard and noticed an old, half-buried chest near the base of a large oak tree. With trembling hands, she dug up the chest and opened it. Inside the chest were old documents, letters, and a diary. The diary belonged to William Wren and detailed the history of the orchard. The entries spoke of a tragic accident that occurred many years ago, a fire that had claimed the lives of several workers and their families. William Wren had been deeply affected by the tragedy and had tried to protect the orchard's legacy by ensuring that the souls of those who perished would be remembered. As Sophia read the diary, she felt a sense of understanding. The silent keeper was not a malevolent spirit but rather a guardian of the orchard's history, a spirit bound to protect and remember those who had died. The silence during storms was a manifestation of the guardian's efforts to keep the memories of the lost souls from being forgotten. With a newfound sense of purpose, Sophia returned to the cottage and wrote a detailed account of her findings. The storm began to wane, and the silence lifted, replaced by the normal sounds of rain and wind. As dawn approached, Sophia packed her things and prepared to leave. The Wrenwood orchard remained a place of beauty and mystery, its secrets now understood but never fully revealed. Sophia's experience had given her insight into the orchard's haunting silence and the guardian that watched over it. She left with a deep respect for the place and its history, knowing that she had uncovered a hidden truth that would forever be a part of the Wrenwood legacy. Ninth story. In the quiet, rural town of Greenfield, there was an old, abandoned mansion that had long been the subject of local gossip and speculation. The mansion, known as the Alcott House, had been uninhabited for decades after a series of tragic events that had left it to decay. The town's residents spoke of strange occurrences, unexplained lights, eerie sounds, and, most disturbingly, the rumors of a cursed mirror within the mansion that was said to hold a dark secret. Clara, a historian with a fascination for haunted places, had heard the stories about the Alcott House and its infamous mirror. Intrigued by the lore, she decided to investigate the mansion for herself. She arrived one evening, just as a storm began to brew, casting a gloomy shadow over the old estate. The mansion's once grand exterior was now overgrown with vines and shrouded in darkness. The Alcott house was as imposing on the inside as it was on the outside. The interior was a labyrinth of dust-covered furniture and cobweb-draped chandeliers. Clara moved cautiously through the mansion, her flashlight casting eerie shadows on the walls. Her goal was to find the mirror and uncover its story. By the time the clock struck midnight, the storm had intensified. Thunder rumbled in the distance, and lightning flashed intermittently, illuminating the mansion with brief bursts of harsh light. Clara's only company was the sound of the storm and the occasional creak of the mansion's old wooden floors. She finally reached the mansion's grand ballroom. The room was enormous, with a high ceiling and large, ornate windows covered in grime. At the far end of the ballroom stood an antique mirror, its frame intricately carved and coated in a thick layer of dust. The mirror was draped with a heavy velvet curtain, which Clara pulled back with some effort. The mirror was an imposing sight. Its surface was tarnished and smudged, but Clara could still make out her reflection. She noticed that the reflection seemed oddly distorted, as if it were not quite in sync with her movements. The sight unsettled her, but she pressed on, determined to uncover the mystery of the mirror. Clara began to examine the mirror closely, noting its ornate frame and the strange patterns etched into its surface. The designs were intricate, almost hypnotic, and seemed to swirl around the mirror's edges. She set up her equipment, cameras and audio recorders, to document any anomalies. As the storm outside raged, Clara noticed that the temperature in the ballroom was dropping rapidly. Her breath formed visible clouds in the chilly air. The storm's wind howled through the mansion's broken windows, adding to the unsettling atmosphere. At exactly 1 a.m., Clara felt a sudden, intense cold. She looked into the mirror and was shocked to see that her reflection had changed. Instead of her own image, the mirror now showed a dimly lit room, one she did not recognize. It appeared to be a room with old-fashioned furniture and a large, four-poster bed. Her heart raced as she turned around to check the ballroom. Everything was as it had been, the room was empty, and the furnishings were covered in dust. When she looked back at the mirror, the strange reflection was still there. The room in the mirror appeared to be inhabited, with the dim flicker of a candlelight casting shadows on the walls. Clara's curiosity overcame her fear. She decided to investigate further and took a step closer to the mirror. As she did, she noticed a faint, ghostly figure standing in the reflection. The figure was of a woman dressed in old-fashioned attire, her face obscured but her eyes filled with sorrow. The reflection of the woman raised a hand and seemed to beckon Clara. She felt a chilling draft and heard a soft, mournful whisper. The whispers grew louder, forming coherent words, "Help me, find the truth." Compelled by the mysterious plea, Clara reached out to touch the mirror. Her fingers brushed against its cold surface, and she felt a jolt of energy surge through her. The mirror's surface rippled, and Clara was suddenly overcome by a vision. She saw a series of images flash before her eyes, scenes of a grand party held in the ballroom, guests in elegant attire, and the mirror hanging in the room. Then, the images shifted to chaos, people screaming, a fire breaking out, and the mirror cracking. The vision ended with a final image of the mirror, now stained with blood. When the vision faded, Clara found herself back in the ballroom. The temperature had dropped further, and the whispers had become a cacophony of anguished voices. The reflection in the mirror was now a dark, swirling void, and the woman's ghostly figure was nowhere to be seen. Desperate to understand what she had seen, Clara searched the ballroom for clues. She found an old ledger hidden beneath a loose floorboard. The ledger belonged to the original owner of the mansion, and its pages contained detailed accounts of a tragic event, a fire that had claimed the lives of several people during a party held in the ballroom. The ledger detailed the story of a woman named Margaret Alcott, who had been the hostess of the ill-fated party. Margaret had perished in the fire, and the mirror was said to have been a gift from her beloved. It was believed that the mirror had been cursed by the tragedy, trapping the souls of those who died in the fire. As Clara read the ledger, she realized that the mirror was a conduit for the spirits trapped in the mansion. The voices she had heard were the cries of those seeking closure and justice. The mirror's power to show alternate reflections was a result of its cursed nature. The storm outside had reached its peak, and the mansion seemed to come alive with the howling wind and creaking walls. Clara knew she had to leave but felt a sense of responsibility to help the trapped souls. She decided to conduct a final ritual to release them from their torment. Using the information from the ledger, Clara performed a cleansing ritual in the ballroom. She recited the words from the ledger and placed candles around the mirror. The room grew colder, and the whispers became more intense. As she completed the ritual, the mirror's surface began to clear, and the ghostly figure of Margaret appeared one last time. Margaret's expression was one of relief and gratitude. The mirror's surface returned to normal, and the room was filled with a sense of peace. The storm outside began to subside, and the silence that followed was profound. Clara left the Alcott house with a sense of accomplishment and closure. The mirror, once a source of terror, had become a symbol of the truth and redemption. The mansion remained a place of mystery, but the curse of the mirror had been lifted, allowing the spirits of the past to finally find peace. 10th story. Deep in the Appalachian Mountains, there stood an old, abandoned radio tower. It was a relic of a bygone era, long since forgotten by the world below. The tower, now rusted and decrepit, had once been a vital link for communication in remote areas. After a catastrophic event that had taken place years ago, it had been left to decay, becoming a ghostly sentinel in the dense forest. Ethan, a young radio enthusiast with a passion for uncovering lost technology, had heard rumors of strange transmissions coming from the tower. Intrigued by the mystery and eager to explore, he decided to spend a night at the base of the old radio tower to investigate. He packed his gear, radio equipment, a flashlight, and camping supplies, and made his way up the winding mountain road. By the time Ethan arrived at the tower, dusk was settling in, and a storm was brewing on the horizon. The sky darkened, and thunder rumbled in the distance. The radio tower loomed above him, its silhouette stark against the darkening sky. He set up his equipment and pitched a small tent near the base, preparing for a night of exploration and monitoring. As night fell, the storm moved closer, bringing with it heavy rain and strong winds. Ethan could see the occasional flash of lightning illuminating the sky and heard the distant roll of thunder. Despite the storm, he was eager to get to work. He connected his radio equipment and began scanning frequencies, hoping to pick up something unusual. At exactly 11 p.m., Ethan picked up a faint signal on one of his radios. It was a repetitive, static-filled transmission that seemed to come from the radio tower itself. The signal was garbled, but Ethan could make out intermittent bursts of coherent speech. It was a chilling mixture of distorted voices and eerie, unintelligible noises. Ethan's curiosity was piqued. He decided to climb the tower to investigate the source of the transmission. The climb was treacherous, with the wind howling and the rain making the metal rung slippery. As he ascended, the tower creaked and groaned, adding to the unsettling atmosphere. Reaching the top, Ethan found the old radio equipment still in place, though covered in rust and grime. The equipment was in disrepair, but there was a working transmitter still emitting the mysterious signal. Ethan carefully examined the transmitter, trying to determine its source. As he worked, the storm intensified. Lightning illuminated the night sky, and the wind howled with a deafening roar. The signal on the transmitter grew stronger, and the voices became more distinct, though still distorted. Ethan could hear phrases like, "help us," and "get out," mixed with static and strange, rhythmic noises. Suddenly, the signal cut out completely, leaving Ethan in a tense silence. He tried to recalibrate the equipment, but it was unresponsive. The storm raged on, and Ethan felt an uneasy chill as if something was watching him. In the silence that followed, Ethan noticed something odd. The storm seemed to have an unnatural quality, with the rain and wind appearing to be trapped within the vicinity of the tower. The air felt thick, almost charged with an otherworldly energy. The tower itself seemed to be vibrating slightly, as if resonating with some hidden force. Ethan's flashlight flickered, and he felt a cold draft pass through him. He turned around and saw a shadowy figure standing on the catwalk just below him. The figure was dark and indistinct, but its presence was unmistakably menacing. Ethan's heart raced as he tried to focus his flashlight on the figure, but it vanished as quickly as it had appeared. The transmitter crackled back to life, and the signal resumed. This time, the transmission was clearer but more urgent. Ethan heard a voice, a woman's voice, pleading for help. The voice was filled with desperation and fear, and it seemed to be coming from the depths of the tower. Determined to understand what was happening, Ethan descended the tower and entered the base station. The interior was dark and musty, with old radio equipment scattered about. The eerie feeling of being watched persisted, and Ethan could hear faint whispers that seemed to come from nowhere. Following the sound of the voice, Ethan found an old, locked door in the back of the base station. The door was marked with strange symbols and warnings that he couldn't decipher. Driven by a sense of urgency, he forced the door open and discovered a hidden chamber. Inside the chamber was a small room with a single, intact radio console. The console was connected to a series of old, dusty tapes. Ethan began to examine the tapes, hoping to find a clue to the source of the transmissions. As he played one of the tapes, he heard a recording of a distress call. The voice was that of a man, explaining that the radio tower had been used for secret government experiments involving communication with unknown entities. The experiment had gone horribly wrong, causing the tower to become a conduit for otherworldly forces. The recording revealed that the tower had trapped the souls of those involved in the experiment, and their voices were now broadcast as a desperate call for help. The storm had somehow amplified the signals, causing the eerie transmissions Ethan had been hearing. The chamber grew colder, and the whispers intensified. Ethan felt a heavy presence, as if the trapped souls were trying to reach out to him. The voices on the tape grew more frantic, urging Ethan to leave before it was too late. Realizing the gravity of the situation, Ethan gathered his equipment and made his way back to the base of the tower. The storm outside had reached its peak, and the wind was howling with a terrifying force. The radio equipment at the base station was now completely silent, and the eerie energy that had pervaded the area seemed to dissipate. As Ethan prepared to leave, he noticed that the shadowy figure he had seen earlier was now watching him from the edge of the forest. The figure remained indistinct, but its presence was unmistakably ominous. Ethan felt a final surge of cold energy and knew that he had to get away quickly. He hurriedly packed his gear and left the tower, driving down the mountain road as the storm began to subside. The rain finally stopped, and the clouds cleared, revealing a moonlit sky. Ethan glanced back at the radio tower, now a dark silhouette against the night. The Alcott house had been a place of lost voices and hidden truths. Ethan's experience had revealed the tower's dark secret and the trapped souls seeking release. As he drove away, he couldn't shake the feeling that the tower's curse had not been fully lifted, and the voices of the past would continue to haunt the mountain for years to come. Thanks for watching.